Hello, and welcome to episode 12 of Conversing on Africa's Peace, a podcast focused on the African Union's Peace and Security Council and key related issues, produced as a collaboration between the Australian Embassy in Addis Ababa and Amani Africa Research and Media Services. My name is Adam. It's good to be with you once more. This episode is a bit special as it marks the 1 year anniversary of Conversing on Africa's Peace. It's been a really interesting project to be part of, and I've learned a lot, and we hope you have too. What better way to celebrate than by welcoming back Dr. Solomon Durso, Amani's founder and executive director. Welcome, Solomon.
Thank you, Adam. Good to be here.
Because we didn't record an episode last month, we thought it only fair that we take a little bit longer to look back at the key topics covered by the PSC in July and August, which of course has included two coups d'etat, amongst other things. So, Solomon, Senegal was the PSC chair in July. Burundi took the chair in August. I feel like there was so much activity in the African peace and security landscape, and that the PSC engaged with a range of critical issues existing and emerging during that time. We've had internal conflicts, insurgencies, rising regional tensions, and more coups d'etat. Take us back for a while, Solomon, and survey some of those key issues for us as you see them over the last 6 or 8 weeks. Obviously, the coups d'etat in Niger and Gabon have dominated the headlines.
Thank you very much, Adam. Yes, the last 2 months, as you rightly pointed out, it's Senegal in July, followed by Burundi in August. In July, under Senegal's chairship, there were 5 sessions that were held by the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, 3 of which focused on thematic issues. The other are related to regional situations, with a briefing on the Sahel focusing on Guinea and some of the countries in the Sahel. Mm-hmm. And the other one obviously added to the agenda of the Peace and Security Council as a result of the extraordinary events that took place in Niamey during 26 to 28 July, last July. And the other regional-specific situation, as I mentioned, relates to those of the Sahel updates. Mm-hmm. So the one interesting thing perhaps worth mentioning is the trend that we have witnessed with the institutionalization of the consultative engagement of the PSC with civil society actors in July. That was one of the highlights because the second consultative meeting between the Peace and Security Council, the Economic, Social and Cultural Council of the African Union, and civil society organizations took place during the month of July. And that was also the occasion during which the Peace and Security Council decided to facilitate the inclusion of civil society organizations beyond the annual consultative meeting in some of the engagements of the peace and security engagements of the Union. Mm-hmm. So, of course, since the first consultative meeting in September 2022, we have witnessed some interesting developments. The establishment of the network of think tanks for peace by the Department of Political Affairs, Peace and Security, under through the leadership of Ambassador Bankole. That's really a very good space to inject the role and contribution of particularly research organizations. The other one is also the network of civil society organizations working on the African Union, particularly on peace and security. These are very important key developments, and during this session the PSC decided that CSOs will be participating in activities of, for example, what the AU calls the Interregional Knowledge Exchange Platform, the IREC, which was launched during the mid-year coordination meeting in 2022. So now the role of CSOs is now to be injected into that platform. and also the Africa Facility for Supporting Transitions, AFSET, which is a joint facility of the African Union and UNDP,
Right.
which is meant to support countries in transition. All right. So these are some interesting developments. Another, I think, development worth mentioning has to do with ministerial meeting during Senegal's chairship that brought focus on what it called community responses to the peace and security challenge of the continent.
Yeah.
This obviously shifts the focus of engagement away from state-based responses to peace and security, because there are many situations in which those bearing the brunt of conflict and insecurity have to actually also try to shield themselves, protect themselves, and in the process, they have a wide range of roles to play, from playing early warning roles to even initiating responses of their own in order to protect their themselves and their livelihoods, as we have seen in many other places. That also highlighted the whole question of civil-military relationship pathway, a subject which foregrounds the session of the Peace and Security Council that is going to be a signature event for the Peace and Security Council for the month of September.
Yeah, indeed.
So these are some of the highlights, I think, for July. But as the month was ending, we came to experience a major event in the Sahel, particularly in Niger, a country that was considered to be an oasis in the desert, or a haven in a sea of trouble, so to speak. So we came to have a trouble in heaven, so to speak, with the occurrence of the coup in Niger, announced, with the arrest of the president, with the blockade of the president by the presidential guard. And it was a slow-moving coup, unlike other coups that we have seen. It took for its completion 2 days. So it was on the 28th of July that we have seen its full completion, because it was on the 28th that they announced the leader of the junta, General Tchani, who is also the head of the presidential guard. So that, I think, raised a very interesting set of issues for the continental peace and security architecture. Of course, the Peace and Security Council convened a meeting on the 28th of July. That is the time that the PST started to respond to deal with the situation.
Responding in real time.
Exactly. I mean, basically, as the situation concretizes with the announcement of the leader of the junta, the PSC convened a meeting on the 28th. Basically, the PSC was also returning from a field mission to Burkina Faso. The PSC was in Burkina Faso at the time, so it was returning from Burkina Faso, and it convened this meeting. At the time, there were the good thing about it is that it was good that the PSC took a decision to convene that meeting, rather than, for example, as it did in September 2021, to wait for the ECOWAS to take a lead and to take cue from ECOWAS's lead, because that would have created quite a bit of complication for the Peace and Security Council. If it decided to wait for ECOWAS, then it would have locked itself into a path that it couldn't change, because then it would have surrendered the leadership role on this file to ECOWAS, and whatever ECOWAS decided might have locked everything for the Peace and Security Council. So there was some wisdom in that sense for the PSC to take that decision and hold a meeting and adopt a communique, which condemned the coup. So on the 28th, the PSC already decided that it was a coup d'etat. All right. Then it gave 15 days
Yeah.
for the return of, power by the military to the civilian authority. All right. I think the ECOWAS held a meeting on 30th July. When ECOWAS held a meeting on 13th July, at the level of heads of state and government, it adopted a set of measures. First, sanctions.
Yeah.
According to, for example, one Nigerian scholar, Jibrin Ibrahim, this is the most comprehensive set of sanctions imposed in the region, in the history of the region. All right, so it is really a very robust.
It's interesting,
set of
isn't it? Increased appetite for that track or for that approach.
Exactly. So if you see, financial and economic sanctions, closure of borders, these obviously, some of them are targeted at the military junta, but most of them are not targeted. Most of them actually end up punishing the wider public. So if goods
Which
and
has been
services...
one of the issues that's held people back, I suppose, in the past from going straight to sanctions.
There is a debate on sanctions that is happening between the PSC and the United Nations Security Council, for example, where, a legitimate debate about whether or not, about making sure that sanctions affect only those, who are designated for their wrongdoing.
Indeed.
They shouldn't be affecting the wider public. So in 2022, the UN Security Council itself adopted a resolution with a humanitarian carve-out, even for sanctions relating to terrorism and other forms of sanctions. That humanitarian access, humanitarian actors should be allowed the space for them to deliver on their life-saving activities, even under those circumstances. So here we have that. The other measure that was adopted is basically to say we don't recognize the de facto authorities. We recognize only the democratically elected government and the President Bazoum. The idea being we don't designate this situation as a coup d'etat. ECOWAS insisted that it is a case of abduction. It is a case of, So that's why they called it an attempt, a coup attempt.
Yes.
They didn't designate it
That's true,
as a
actually,
coup.
isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. The third and most dominant aspect of ECOWAS's decision was the threat to deploy military force. This is, basically these set of measures, by their very nature, ended up crowding the space. And in crowding the space, they actually undermined the diplomatic track. They suck the air out of diplomatic processes. Everybody is basically focusing on the sanctions and their consequences, focusing on whether or not ECOWAS is going to deploy. If it deploys, what's going to happen? What kind of consequences are these deployments going to have? Are these deployments going to be legitimate? Are they legal? So these set of questions dominated the airwaves, the debates and the discussions,
Indeed.
leaving very little space for the diplomatic track. All right. So this is, basically the what happened in July, and of course all of these spilled into August. Right. And I think we can discuss about what happened in August around Niger, but also August became the month in the history of the PSC during which the PSC had the unfortunate condition of being on sanctioning or suspending 2 of its member states. This is the first in the history of the Peace and Security Council of the Union.
So Where are we at now on the Niger situation? Has the dust settled in terms of those competing views or competing agendas between the ECOWAS, the Regional Economic Community, and the African Union Peace and Security Council's position?
It looks like that we are on. We have some kind of compromise, some kind of working arrangement having been, worked out. I think it's worth asking the question here. When ECOWAS met at the level of heads of state on the 10th of August, one of the decisions that it took was to request the African Union to endorse all its decisions with respect to the situation in Niger. And this put the Peace and Security Council on the spotlight, all right? Because some of the decisions taken by ECOWAS, particularly the deployment of military force in order to reinstate the deposed president back to power, raised widespread concern from the perspective of, for example, its security implications. If you deploy a force against Nigerian army, would that lead to a fight that would draw in countries such as Burkina Faso and Mali, who actually threatened that they would throw their weight behind the Nigerian army, and you may end up having a regional fighting between ECOWAS forces and three of the armies of the members of the ECOWAS.
But in the end, the PSC stopped short
The PSC
of getting behind it.
Exactly. The PSC actually was very uncomfortable. Many members of the PSC were very uncomfortable about that situation. Also from the perspective of some of the signal that they were getting from other countries neighboring Niger. These include, for example, Algeria, which announced publicly and very clearly its rejection of the use of military force. It insisted that this has to be addressed through a diplomatic means. Similarly, Chad also expressed concern about basically it not being drawn into whatever may happen on its western front, because Chad, as you know, is already in a fragile situation domestically. It is having a very serious problem on its eastern border with the war in Sudan, and then in its northern border where rebel groups operate against the central government in Chad from Libya. So it is a very delicate situation.
Indeed.
To top it off, you also have Niger sitting in the middle of a terrorism hotspot, the Sahel. If you beat Nigerian armed forces, wouldn't you be exposing Niger to be overrun by terrorist groups? That is the other side of the concern that was raised. That is why, for example, when the PSC, it met on the 14th of August, remember when it met on the 14th of August, ECOWAS countries, understandably, they have to follow the decision of their heads of state, asked for the PSC to endorse the decisions of ECOWAS. All right? And that is a logical thing for them to do, right? And from an ECOWAS standpoint, the other concern obviously is if we don't act firmly and strongly on Niger, then coups are going to knock on everyone's door. If you hear the president of Cote d'Ivoire speak, you clearly see that it was about also self-preservation. It was not just about Niger as well, all right? You understand that, but they didn't really take into account all these different ramifications or consequences that their engagement in Niger to put President Bazoum back to power and the perils that it has. There is that dimension of it. So the PSC, what did it do? It says it took note of the decision, and then it asked the Commission to make an assessment of the
implications, yes.
of the such a deployment.
Yeah.
Because the PSC had to satisfy itself that first and foremost, it's as one member of the PSC put it, it is a council of peace and security. It's not a council of war.
Right.
That's it's a very interesting way of saying. So it has to engage in that kind of diplomatic first, politics first approach to, particularly with respect to coups, right? If it is a case of Article 4H of the Constitutive Act, matters involving mass atrocities, and therefore for purpose of protecting civilians from genocide, war crimes, you understand that kind of deployment. But it is difficult to say that you deploy now because you want to reinstate a deposed government back to power, while you haven't done anything in situations of mass atrocities, including with respect to the atrocities that are being committed in the Sahel in the context of terrorist attacks that are unfolding there. So you have this situation. So what happened in the end is basically the majority of members of the Peace and Security Council, they were of the view that priority should be given for resolving this situation through diplomacy.
Yeah.
But importantly, you have to remember the other side of the difference is that while ECOWAS didn't recognize the coup, the PSC did recognize the coup. The PSC did recognize the coup on the 28th of July.
Okay.
All right?
Yeah.
The ECOWAS was insisting that there was no coup. It was just an attempt coup, and it is an abduction of the president. These differences are extremely important. The PSC, after having determined that it's a coup on the 28th, it can't come on the 14th of August and say it is an attempted coup. It's difficult for the PSC to do that. Actually, the PSC said it is a coup 2 times. On the 28th of July, and then on the 31st of July, when it considered another important session, which we didn't mention in July, that is the receipt of the election report of the chairperson of the Commission on Elections in Africa.
Yes, of course.
All right?
Yeah.
During that session, the PSD reiterated its condemnation of the coup in Niger.
Okay.
So it designated appropriately the coup.
Right.
All right. So after saying 2 times it's a coup, there is no way that the Peace and Security Council can come back on the 14th of August and say it is an attempted coup and therefore it calls for the reinstatement of President Bazoum again.
I understand.
All right. So you have this. All right.
So unfortunately, we have to consider another coup in Gabon. Some similarities and some differences, important differences. Very briefly, reflect on how you saw that play out and the PSC's fairly rapid response.
So, indeed, unlike in Niger, this was much more straightforward for the Peace and Security Council. There isn't a case of, a need or strong desire for reinstating the deposed president in this particular case. I think there might have been one country that might have called for a reinstatement of the deposed president. Other than that, the coup was considered as something that is a done deal.
Yeah.
And there wasn't that much policy contestation between the AU and the regional organization, the Economic Community of Central African States, ECAS. ECAS also condemned the coup. So in that sense, there was much more cohesion and common position on the coup in Gabon. Of course, as you rightly said, the coup in Gabon is completely different from the coup in Niger. The coup in Gabon was preceded by a disputed election.
Elections, yeah.
General elections were held on the 26th of August, but soon after the convening of the election, the government imposed a nighttime curfew, and it also closed internet.
Yep.
There were no international observers.
Yeah.
Some international media houses were also suspended. So the conditions in which the elections were held were such that they actually clearly indicate that there is an attempt to orchestrate the rigging, orchestrate the cooking of the results of the election.
And it's interesting, the two communiques are different, right? The Gabon one straight away calls for free, fair, credible, transparent elections to be organised as quickly as possible, in amongst the other things that it asked for from Gabon.
Exactly. I mean, the only thing is it didn't really contextualize that call for free and fair elections, because it didn't, for example, speak about the background context that triggered the coup. And the other dimension, of course, as far as this particular coup is concerned, it's difficult to say that it is a proper coup in the way other coups are. For example, the ones in Guinea, where basically really the government of President Condé was totally removed. Here you have head of the presidential guard, who was an insider, all right, a family member of the Ali Bongo region, right? I mean, in a way, you can say that this is more of not even a palace coup, it's a household coup. It is among members of the family. The power still remains within the family in that sense. So it's difficult to say that this really marks a change in government. The only thing that you see is a change in the leader. The leader is gone, but the system remains the same.
But the PSC communique and the expulsion came very fast,
Yes.
within 24 hours,
That's
pretty
right.
much.
Yeah.
Which shows maybe a degree of concern about, as you said, having two coups to deal with so quickly, back to back. Almost.
I mean, within months,
Yeah.
it is the first for the PSC to suspend two countries from the activities of the Union under Article 30 of the Constitutive Act of the African Union. But the speed also is indicative that as far as this particular case is concerned, there isn't that much the kind of dispute that you might have the kind of nuance, because in Niger, in one way or another, you can say that it is a democratically elected government, and therefore it kind of gives rise to a whole lot of debates and questions. But in this case, yes, indeed, it's a very quick one. But how they are going to implement the decision of the PSD, particularly as it relates to restoration of constitutional order. So it talks about transfer of power by the military going to the barracks and handing over to a civilian authority. Is this a transitional civilian authority? What are we talking about? There is a lack of some clarity, but I think indeed the speed was very interesting.
Well, that's what people like you get paid to track, and we'll talk to you about it as these issues undoubtedly continue to twist and turn in the months to come. For the sake of time, let's have a look at September. Cameroon takes the chair of the PSC for September, and Cameroon's chairship is coming at a really interesting time, as we've discussed, in the context of growing concerns around these unconstitutional changes of government, financial challenges in managing peace support operations wherever they are, difficult political transitions, ongoing issues of terrorism. It's also coming within the backdrop of a few interesting other events this month: the commemoration of Africa Amnesty Month, International Peace Day, 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Climate Summit in Nairobi, and if that wasn't enough, the 78th session of the UN General Assembly in New York, which has an AU-PSC aspect connected to it. So a really big month. Cameroon's permanent representative to the AU, His Excellency Ambassador Churchill Iwumbe Monono, has said that he wants the focus of Cameroon's chairship to be on civil-military relations, which is indeed a timely theme. Amani's analysis identifies a number of substantive sessions and a couple of country-specific issues in amongst thematic ones. So one session at ministerial level, all other sessions at ambassadorial level. And I also understand, I think it's right that the PSC will undertake a trip to Mozambique associated with this Amnesty Month. So let's plough through each session, and I invite you to share your thoughts. So on the 7th of September, the AU will update on the drawdown of the AU transition mission in Somalia, ATMIS. 3,000 more troops due to come out or conclude their mission by the end of September. This drawdown comes at a critical time for Somalia's peace and security. How do you see it, Solomon, and what will be discussed in that session?
So that would be the first session of the month.
Yeah.
This is coming at a time when the African Union Transitional Support Mission to Somalia is preparing for the second drawdown of ATMIS troops.
Yeah.
You remember that the first drawdown involved the withdrawal of 2,000 troops that happened in June after its postponement for 6 months on the request of the Somali government. The second installment of the drawdown involves 3,000 troops, and it is going to take place at the end of September, this month actually. It is happening against a backdrop of a number of important developments. One has to do with the counter-offensive that the Somali government is undertaking against Al-Shabaab. This has been ongoing quite for some time. Some gains have been announced, but a bit of quite setbacks, serious setbacks in this offensive against Al-Shabaab. Over the course of the past 2 weeks, various reports of major loss sustained by Somali security forces. It also comes against the background of the Operation Black Lion that the frontline countries have committed to undertake, and that hasn't taken off as yet. It's not clear when this is going also to become fully operational at this point in time. Somali security forces, supported by ATMIS, are at the forefront of basically taking the fight to Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab has also been really active, orchestrating very serious, deadly attacks in Mogadishu and other places. Some of these actually led to, as you may recall, the issuance of a statement by the Peace and Security Council on the attacks that targeted, for example, the front line defense lines that were handed over by ATMIS to Somali security forces. Soon after the handover of these attacks occurred in at least two of those places. So, and of course, some of the attacks that Al-Shabaab also orchestrated to penetrate into Ethiopia earlier, we have seen, and then in Kenya as well, a few attacks that were orchestrated as well. So, part of the question that this session would address is this one. One, whether or not ATMIS have made the necessary preparations, taking the lesson from the transfer of responsibility to Somali security forces that took place in the first round of the drawdown. Second, whether Somali security forces are ready and able to also take over security responsibilities when the 3,000 troops would be withdrawn from Somalia at the end of September. There is an assessment that the UN Security Council sanctioned in terms of looking at the lessons, but also the impact of the withdrawal of the 2,000 troops from Somalia, which would be due on the 15th of September. So the Peace and Security Council also would come to see where things are with respect to that process. So the ATMIS head and the special representative of the chairperson of the African Union Commission would provide update on all of these developments.
Okay.
And the Somalia government is also expected to provide updates on how things are going with respect to the offensive against Al-Shabaab, but also, of course, on the overall security situation in the country and what their thoughts are in terms of their readiness to take over responsibility upon the withdrawal of the 3,000 troops.
Okay.
And of course, it has to consider if and whether the withdrawal or the drawdown should continue in its current timeline,
Right.
or is there a need for any adjustment for the drawdown?
Weighty issues to start the month, no doubt about that. Moving on to the next session, this is the field visits or the trip to Maputo, Mozambique. Tell us about this trip and how this kind of Africa Amnesty Month came around, if you don't mind.
So this is linked to the one of the major projects of Agenda 2063, which is connected to silencing in the Peace and Security Council, silencing the guns, basically.
Sure.
So one of the aspects of the efforts for this ambitious project of silencing the guns is the amnesty, the designation of September as the amnesty month. The idea is to encourage those who are in possession of illegal weapons to surrender those illegal weapons without them being considered as having committed criminal offense for the illegal possession of those weapons. It's also meant to highlight the outsized role that small and light weapons play as drivers and accelerators of insecurity and violence, whether it is in settings of civil war or in settings of terrorism, as we have in many parts of the continent. So it is really meant to draw that attention to the very serious consequences and adverse impact of light weapons and small arms in facilitating and driving conflicts on the continent.
Okay, that's a very noble sentiment, and hopefully one which is successful again this year. Looking ahead, on the 18th of September, the PSC will be briefed on the maritime security situation in the Gulf of Guinea, which was last considered towards the end of last year. Very briefly, Solomon, what can we expect from this session? What's changed since, I guess, the session in, when was it, late 22?
That's right. So Gulf of Guinea, previously it was the Gulf of Aden that had a very serious problem of piracy and other forms of maritime insecurity. With that situation being resolved, the Gulf of Guinea, for a number of reasons, became one of the regions affected by maritime insecurity. But there have been positive developments as far as the level of the number of incidents of piracy activities are concerned, the level of incidents of criminal activities on the sea is concerned. That is, on the positive side. Whether or not, however, that is indicative of the end of the problem, there is a very serious question. It is doubtful that it is the end of the problem. That is why there is a need for revisiting what's happening there. Importantly, I think this is an occasion also for the PSC to review and update itself about the maritime security arrangement, not just in the Gulf of Guinea, but also broadly. In the Gulf of Guinea, because there is a particular security situation that deserves immediate attention. what activities are being undertaken there in order to address the insecurity in the Gulf of Guinea, what security mechanisms have been put in place, and what are the challenges for putting in place these security mechanisms, and what more needs to be done. These are the kinds of questions that the PSC may address itself to.
Okay. Moving on, I'm mindful of time. The next session on the 20th of September is Cameroon's kind of signature thematic session on civil-military relations in Africa. As we've said, timely issues. We've touched on this in a variety of ways. But I understand, I could be wrong, that this is the first time that it's been analysed so explicitly by the Peace and Security Council as a theme.
As a theme that is with an exclusive focus, right.
Yeah.
Although, the Peace and Security Council would touch on these things
in so many other ways.
In so many other ways.
Yeah.
When it talks about, for example, security sector reform,
right,
in a context of countries in transition from peace to from conflict to peace, in post conflict reconstruction and development setting, in peace building setting, or in countries implementing peace agreements, such as South Sudan, for example. It kind of, in one way or another, touches on this issue, but as something that also connects to military coups as well. Military coups, in one way or another, signify the existence of a problem in civil-military relationship as well. Yeah. So, in that sense, this session is also very vital and important. One of the issues that it would address, obviously, has to do with the question of professionalism of the army. Mm-hmm. And this question of professionalism of the army also has to do with the republican character of the army and its commitment to the constitutional order, to the defense of the territory of the country. Mm-hmm. Because the army essentially and the military essentially have a very important role, which, if it gets politicized, can have very adverse consequences for the governance of the country, for the peace and security of the country. Yeah. That is why this whole issue of, civil-military relationship, particularly bringing basically the use of force. Mm-hmm. That is what we are talking about.
Exactly.
And the use of force has to be brought under democratically elected civilian oversight. Mm-hmm. That is extremely critical. Mm-hmm. That its use would be determined and decided under a constitutionally mandated, democratically elected civilian authority.
Indeed.
All right?
Yeah.
So that division of responsibility between the military being under the command of civilian authority is extremely important. The other dimension, of course, has to do with the governance dimension of the security sector.
Right.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
That dimension is extremely important because it is the lack of democratic governance, the lack of proper governance that creates conditions for the interference of the army in politics.
Yeah.
And the army, starting to actually seek power, so to speak.
Mm. Well, I commend Cameroon for scheduling that theme for that session on the 20th of September. The next session, as we work through the month, will be at ministerial level in the margins of the UN General Assembly. Appropriately, I guess, it's going to consider the financing of AU peace support operations. I feel like there's been a lot of talk about this in the last few months, and maybe some incremental progress on the issue after a long sort of stalemate, if you like. How do you see this session playing out, Solomon?
So the ministerial session obviously happening in New York on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. It's not uncommon for the PSC to hold such sessions on the sidelines of the General Assembly, but this also coincides with some of the progress that was being made within the UN Security Council towards the tabling of a resolution on the adoption of a framework resolution on the financing of African Union peace support operations financed through UN assist contributions. The UN Secretary General released a report in May, on the 25th of May, actually, Africa Day, during which Amani Africa had an opportunity to address the UN Security Council exactly on this item, highlighting why this matters and in the context of, in relation to the peace and security issues that we have seen, Adam. These are contexts that require robust engagement through multilateral platforms. And it is the weakness or the absence of these engagements through multilateral processes that is opening the space for countries basically to align themselves and to seek support from anyone willing to give it, whether it is private military forces, whether it is that is Wagner or not, they basically go and have it because these multilateral robust engagements are lacking. That is one of the reasons why you need to have, because UN missions are not going to do this. That's why we have seen UN missions running into difficulty in Mali, Central African Republic, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. That robust response involving peace enforcement can come, and we have seen it come only from African Union forces, because the AU is doing it as we speak. We talked about it earlier in Somalia, for example. All right, but you need to enable that, and that enabling can only come through support from the UN Security Council, and of course the other dimension of it has to do with burden sharing. African countries are contributing through troops and therefore through the lives and limbs of men and women in uniform. The UN can share the burden through the use of UN assist contributions. The specific details of how this can be done, I think that is where we are stuck.
Indeed.
The mechanics of it. I think there is also some progress for even unlocking that, including, for example, the AU contributing through the Peace Fund financially for the financial burden, but also the progress that have been made around human rights and humanitarian law compliance, and some of the technical issues. I think there is quite a lot that has been done. It is hoped that under the leadership of Ghana, which is the one leading the African 3 members of the Security Council, there is a path for achieving and securing this long-standing resolution.
Well, we hope so, and we'll track it with great interest. Mindful of time, we've got 2 sessions to touch upon. The first one being the 27th of September session, sort of a post-Malabo summit check-in on humanitarian issues, I guess, seeking to get a sense of whether the AU is on track to realise some of those Malabo ambitions. We note the continuity of several fairly grim humanitarian situations on the continent, Sudan and elsewhere. Very briefly, Solomon, what's going to be the key takeaways, do you think, from that session on humanitarian issues?
So one of them would be, obviously, as you may recall, Malabo. One of the decisions was operationalization of the African Humanitarian Agency. That is one of the issues that would be on the spotlight during this post-Malabo engagement involving the UN High Commission for Refugees as well. That is one issue. The other issue would be the question of also the funding of the humanitarian agency, but also, broadly speaking, humanitarian issues on the African continent. As you rightly said, the humanitarian situation in some of these conflict hotspots is very grim. One can mention Sudan, where we have received an extraordinary statement from the UN humanitarian chief suggesting that war and humanitarian crisis would lead to the collapse of Sudan. So we are actually witnessing very dire humanitarian crisis, perhaps one of the worst humanitarian crisis as we speak today, is unfolding here.
Yeah.
So it is the question of, how do we go about mobilizing humanitarian diplomacy as well in response to these conditions and the kind of relationship that need to exist in terms of the role of humanitarian actors like the UN High Commission for refugees.
Yeah. Okay, so in the interest of time, 29th of September, an update on the political transitions in Guinea and Mali. Your quick thoughts on that, please, Solomon.
I think this has been a recurrent theme.
Yeah.
Actually, the Peace and Security Council had expressed concern about the slow pace of the transition processes in these countries previously. It would seem that there, in Mali, at least the constitutional process has been finalized. Now the question really is whether or not the timeline for the convening of election would be respected and carried out. And of course, with respect to Guinea as well, the pace of developments relating to the transitional government and the transitional timelines is also another issue. But it is something that the PSC had already expressed in July and even in August, that it is very concerned about the pace of the slow pace of movement there.
Yeah, I see. Okay. Thank you, Solomon. That brings us nearly to the end of another episode. As always, we wish Cameroon well as it takes the chair for September, and we wish everybody taking part in the work of the PSC productive discussions on those important topics that we've outlined briefly today. I'd also like to encourage people to dig deeper into the Peace and Security Council's agenda by accessing Amani's range of analytical products. The Australian Embassy is very pleased to support the insights on the Peace and Security Council analysis that Amani does on the program each month. And we hope this podcast is a useful accompaniment to that work. Solomon, thanks for joining me and sharing your encyclopedic insights with me and our listeners, and happy anniversary to Conversing on Africa's Peace.
Thank you. Thank you. It has been a wonderful journey, Adam.
Indeed, I really do enjoy it, and we hope our listeners do too. Before we go, as usual, we wish the following African states happy National Days of Celebration in September. We have Eswatini on the 6th of September, Mali on the 22nd, Guinea-Bissau on the 24th of September, and Botswana on the 30th of September. We wish you all peace and prosperity.
Thank you very much. It has been wonderful to come back and have this anniversary event with you, Adam. We look forward to the next edition. Until then, all the very best.